Thank you. Yeah, you'll notice I'm going to try and use this live captioning. It's not picking me up right now. I just found it yesterday and I thought it would be interesting to try. And we'll just see how it goes. But anyway, as I was introduced, I'm Heather Turner. I'm chair of the Forwards Task Force for Women and Underrepresented Groups, which is an R Foundation task force that was set up just over 4 years ago. The R Foundation, for people that haven't heard of it before, is a not-for-profit organisation that was set up to support the R project. And I'm going to be talking today about looking forward, how can we move towards greater equity and inclusion in the R community. And I'm going to jump straight to the current challenges because I discovered I had a lot to say. So I don't have time to go back over what we've been doing over the past few years. But if you want to talk to me more about that, we can do that at the reception. So what are the current challenges as I see it? I think I'm going to focus on two aspects, the user community, and there I think the current challenge is really to outreach beyond white women. That's not to say that everything's sort of solved as far as women goes, but I think we're doing quite well as a community in terms of outreach, and it's not too surprising that if you start with a group that is mostly white men, that the first beneficiaries are white women. You don't have to look too far. You don't have to change very much to get white women to join. So I think this is a focus for the user community. In terms of the developer community, though, I think it's still just pretty broad that we want to widen participation from all underrepresented groups, including all women, which you might think, well, that was sort of the original problem when the Forwards Task Force was set up 4 years ago. It's still a current challenge. It's a harder problem to address than just reaching out to users. And so I'll look at that in some detail as well. So starting with the user community then, and thinking about how we can reach out to groups that are currently underrepresented. And when we're thinking about this in general, I think there's two principles that we need to hold in tension that are summed up in these two quotes I've got here. The first one, nothing about us without us, which is quite a common saying amongst activists, particularly disability activists in recent years. And the idea here, of course, is that if you want to help a particular group, you've got to involve that group, find out what their priorities are, what their issues are, and make sure that what you're trying to do is actually helpful. On the other hand, we have this quote from Toni Morrison, the very serious function of racism is distraction. And the point there is that we can actually make things worse by asking people from underrepresented groups to spend their time explaining the problems, proposing solutions, and implementing those solutions, so they're actually distracted from their work and they have even less time than they had before to contribute. So we have to find a balance here, and what we've tried to do as a task force is to get behind people as they've tried to do things in the community, and I'm going to demonstrate that by looking at 3 particular groups today. Starting with minority ethnic and racial groups. Just a few weeks ago, there was our studio conf, and there was this nice tweet from Danielle Smalls-Perkins, and she says this: "Dear Danielle, remember these incredibly brilliant, talented, and kind women data scientists whenever you feel like the only one on a team or in a space. Thanks to our Studio Conf 2020 for bringing us together, #OurLadies." And a couple of really nice photos of people she met at the conference. And this just underlines the experience of a person from a minority ethnic group in the United States and the difference it makes to go to a conference and meet people that you have more in common with, particularly when you feel isolated at work. You're the only one on your team, you're the only black person or the only person from a particular group in our user group. It can be quite isolating and lonely, and it's really encouraging for these get-togethers. And inspired by that, she teamed up with Doris Scott, who was also at our studio comp and is also a member of the Forwards task force. And they've launched this new thing, as announced by Doris. Do you identify as an underrepresented minority user of R or want to help support minority users? If so, MyR is the group for you. You can sign up here, and I include that link on the next slide. I should say the slides, I've put the URL at the bottom, and so if you want to follow any of the links, you can click, go to that link and click on them later. So if you want to help people from minority ethnic groups, let people know about this new community in your workplace, in your R user group, and so on, and join the group, if you're from a minority ethnic group yourself, or if you particularly want to support this initiative, it is open to allies as well. And just yesterday, Doris wrote a Medium post starting to set out what they hope to do with this community. For example, set up a Slack group for people to network, set up a Twitter account, and so on. So that is all just starting to take off now. Next group I want to look at is people in underserved regions. And by this I mean people living in geographical areas that don't benefit from all the R conferences, meetup groups, local R experts that we do, for example, in Europe and the US. One thing that the R Foundation is doing is to start to think, to change the format of Use R and to introduce regional hubs. We're having a pilot in Munich this year. Munich is not an underserved region. However, it was a sort of easy place to start and to test the idea, and then hopefully we can scale up and include underserved regions in future. The main motivation was actually environmental to get started. We're obviously very aware of climate change and the environmental cost of having an international conference where everybody is expected to fly to one place. However, it has huge benefits when we think about people from underserved regions as well. It reduces the financial cost, reduces travel time, and opens up other potential, for example, the potential to allow languages other than English, and also avoids visa issues, which is a real problem for people outside of the more privileged regions. Often it's easy for people to go to neighbouring countries, but much more difficult for, say, somebody from Southern Africa to go to the US, for example. And we could start to innovate a bit more, to think about remote participation. It worked really nicely just now with Hadley. Maybe we could, as the technology becomes a bit more reliable and we get more comfortable with it, perhaps that's something that we can also incorporate, which will expand the reach even further. Another initiative that I'd like to highlight is the Africa R community, which started last year. And it was sort of made its initial steps, but at the beginning of this year, they set up a new leadership team. And I've got pictures of them all here. It has representatives from Egypt, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa. So they've just set up this new leadership team, and they've set out their plans for 2020 to write their governing documents like the mission statement and code of conduct. They'd like to set up a rotating curator Twitter account, a bit like the We Are R Ladies one, if you've seen that. Focus on tutorials in French. So again, language is quite a big barrier, particularly in Western Africa, a lot of French speakers. Work on their website. So up to now, they've mainly been communicating through Twitter, but they'd like to establish their website. And work on R packages and statistical problems that are specific to their needs. For example, a natural language programming library that supports Arabic and Swahili. So lots of ambitious plans, and follow the Twitter if you'd like to keep up to date with all of that. One thing that's particularly useful when trying to work with people in underserved regions is if we can connect people. So if you have contacts in any region, Africa, Latin America, India, and so on, do share your contacts with forwards. It's really useful to have potential speakers, hosts for meetups and workshops and so on. Another really useful way you can help out is if you've prepared a talk for your iUser group or a conference, is to reach out to local groups when you're traveling, or even offer to present remotely. So this is something we've done. For example, Kevin O'Brien from Forwards gave a remote talk. He's based in Ireland. He gave a remote talk to the Tanzanian iUser group, and it's really encouraging to them to have somebody else from the R community showing that they're interested and sharing their expertise. You can, of course, prepare a totally new talk, but I'm suggesting that it's not too much effort to offer something that you've already given before, and then they get a nice polished talk. The last user group that I want to talk about are disabled and deaf users. It's kind of why I wanted to try out this live captioning, see how that worked. First, I want to talk about blind users. So Jonathan Godfrey is a blind statistics lecturer in New Zealand, and he's done a lot of work. He's a member of Forwards, but even before then, he was already starting to work on resources for blind users. So he's written a tutorial that's specifically aimed at blind users, helping them get set up in R so they can use it with screen readers. He maintains the blind R user group mailing list, and he's written a package to support blind users, for example, that gives text descriptions of graphics and a write-R software to produce R Markdown documents. At the moment, RStudio, for example, isn't accessible to blind users, although they are working on it. And he's already also written tips for people who want to make their work accessible to people with visual impairments, people that use screen readers. And I give a link there with some tips about how you can make your Markdown documents more accessible. Liz Hare, another blind user, in fact, who recently joined the Forwards task force, has been working on developing best practices for events, not just thinking about blind people, but more generally about disabled and deaf people. And this has been she just started it last year, and it's already starting to inform how we prepare for Use R. For example, in our recent call for proposals, we started to think upfront about the facilities of the venue. For example, does it have step-free access? Does it have disabled parking? And other facilities of the venue, like gender-neutral bathrooms, whether they allow children on the premises. It's obviously much easier to think about these things up front and identify any deficiencies, which you can then hopefully mitigate or at least inform people about, so they know and can make a choice as to whether it's good enough for them to come. So what can people do? Educate yourself and others about accessibility. Try to improve what you do, how you create your content, how you share your content, to remove barriers. Expect disabled people at your events, not just as attendees, but in all roles, as speakers, as chairs, as committee members, and be proactive about removing barriers to inclusion. Don't wait for people to ask, because then you're putting the burden on them to do all the chasing and finding out who they should contact and so on. If you have experience in this area, then do take a look at our best practices and give feedback on those. One thing I'd like to do some work on, and I'd be interested if anybody's would like to work on this, is to think about some R-specific advice for making for creating accessible or inclusive presentations, for example, in terms of the format, taking account of colour blindness, these types of issues. And also advice for social media managers. So particularly for conferences, you'll get somebody that takes on a Twitter account just for a year. They've not necessarily thought about accessibility, and so they can make easy mistakes, like putting important information in an image rather than giving the text. So it'd be good to have some advice for those people. So I focused on three particular minority groups. And I just thought I'd sort of wrap up a little bit with some general ways of supporting underrepresented groups. If you're an organizer of a user group or other event, then do look out for the best practices that are provided by Forwards and other people. So Noah Tamir, another member of Forwards, is working on a guide for meetups and thinking about, well, what's reasonable for a small meetup? You know, what reasonable, easy accommodations can you make to reduce the barriers? And generally just be a bit proactive to expand your networks, people that aren't just like yourself, on Twitter, when you go to conferences. Get behind these initiatives that are driven by the community. Share the opportunities you have for coding projects, for internships, for jobs, to your expanded network, or specifically to groups like Our Ladies or MyR. And when you're trying to help, think about what you can do to lessen the burden, to take on some of the busy work and the not so exciting stuff so that people from underrepresented groups can get on with some interesting work. I think as the R Foundation, there's more we can do beyond what Forwards is already working on. One particular thing I think could be improved is the information that we give out on the R Project webpage. I met someone from Namibia just recently. She'd been in the UK for about a year and a half, and I met her just a few days before she was going back to Namibia to work at the National Statistics Agency. And I was chatting about community things. She hadn't heard of R Stats Twitter. She didn't know that there was a local R user group. And I think we need to do better about communicating what resources there are. At the moment, it doesn't say anything about Forwards on the R Project webpage. There's no pointers to community groups. So I think that's something we could work on, and possibly also put these resources for blind R users, so it's not relying on somebody external to provide that resource. And in the same vein, possibly adopt the blind R user group mailing list as a formal R mailing list to ensure its sustainability. I need to talk about Jonathan about that. I did send my notes for feedback, but he's right in the middle of a very busy teaching session. So these are just some ideas at the moment. Okay, second half, the developer community. I'm going to start by thinking about developer meetings. So we heard a couple of times this morning, I think, from Peter and from Roger about the Directions in Statistical Computing workshop. It's sort of been in two formats. So in the early days, it was a more typical conference format. In more recent years, it's had a more workshop format where there's been invited speakers and invited participants, which has ended up being mostly our foundation members plus special guests. And it's taken place just a couple of days or a day before Use R. And I think this format puts some barriers to inclusion. For example, the people that are invited as special guests, particularly if they're from underrepresented groups, can feel a bit out of place. They're a new person that's coming to a meeting where people have been working together for years or decades, and they might be in the minority in some way. Often they're expected to come as experts already with something to present that's as good as what other people are presenting, where the other people are our foundation, our core members. Community members that would be interested are often left out, and the information is not shared, at least in a formal way. There's no proceedings, no reports, no live streaming. We can contrast that with the R implementation, optimization and tooling workshop, which is a developer workshop that is supported by the R Consortium in recent years. It has a slightly different format. It has an open call for speakers, and it's open to all UseR participants because it's in parallel with UseR. And you'd think, well, maybe that sounds a bit more open, more transparent. However, I think there's still barriers there. For example, it's organised quite separately to the main conference, so possibly the organisers aren't making the same effort to reach out to underrepresented groups. And there's often very little promotion to the general community. The details are hidden away on a separate website. So I think in recent years, in some ways, the developer community has been separating from the user community in a not very helpful way. I'm happy to say that there have been some developments just recently. So, for example, DSC this year, the speakers are going to be invited, but anyone will be able to attend. Last year, the Riot workshop was at least advertised on the USAR 2019 website, so people could, in theory, find out what was going on. But I think there's still a lot of room for improvement, and we need better liaison with the R Foundation Conference Committee and the USAR organisers to promote these events with a focus on diversity, and just make more people aware that these events are going on and that they're welcome to come. And I think it would also be useful to think about alternative formats. So these are very much lecture-based, as we've had today, talk-based events, which is fine, but perhaps we should also think about more alternative formats, such as breakout sessions, which enable new contributors to come, possibly very experienced R users, but still new to a particular area, where they can sit with other experts, have a bit more of a discussion, and as they hear a particular topic being discussed, then they can start to contribute ideas, which is just not the way a sort of typical talk workshop works. Okay, package development. This is an area that Forwards has been working on. We got a grant a few years ago from the R Consortium to develop some workshop materials. We have a full-day version and a 2-hour version. The full-day version has been run in a number of cities that I've listed here, and we're planning a couple more, which actually goes beyond what we proposed in the grant. We've managed to stretch it a bit. And we're currently trying to document, write a guide so that other people can use our materials, which are all Creative Commons license, to run the workshop themselves, either as a day event or over a series of weeks in an R user group. So I think this is useful. We can train people how to write an R package. However, I think we have to recognise that there is a lot of reluctance and nervousness among some people, and it's something I come across quite regularly, working with R ladies and other underrepresented groups. People are a bit reluctant or nervous to submit to CRAN, and this can be for many reasons. They might have had a bad experience themselves, or they might have heard of somebody who's had a bad experience trying to submit a package to CRAN, or trying to ask a question on one of the official mailing lists. And a lot of people are doing this as voluntary work, as a side project, of course, and they just decide it's not worth their trouble. They don't need this hassle in their life, and they decide not to publish on CRAN. And maybe they just host it on GitHub, or maybe they don't publish it anywhere. For those people that do persevere, they recognise the value of putting a package on CRAN. There's still a lot of hoops to jump through. There's a lot of information to digest. I converted the Writing R Extensions manual to PDF, and it was about 270 pages, I think. And of course, you don't need to read it all, but you still need a bit of experience to pull out the information you need, or you can easily miss information and then possibly get moaned at. There's the CRAN repository policy. There's a checklist for new submissions, which is actually intended to help people identify common issues, but I'm not sure it's very well known about. The feedback people can get can be a bit unpredictable and underspecified, and if they don't have anybody with experience that they can turn to talk this through, it can be a struggle for them to know how to respond. And even if everything goes fine and there's no problems, it's still quite an involved process. The first time you do it, you have to update your news, your description, you run your checks, you run your tests. There's a lot of things to remember. There is an R package devel mailing list, but I would say it provides limited support. It can still be intimidating for a new person to post something to a mailing list where people have a lot more experience than them. And it's sort of best for very specific questions. I've got this issue, I've tried this, what do I do? And if you're new and it's the first time, you might have lots of questions and you might be a bit worried about, repeatedly posting to a list. So I think there's a bit of potential here that this is just an idea that I've sort of had for a while, but I'd like to see get off the ground. Just a basic onboarding service inspired by the rOpenSci one. That is a bit more involved because it involves code review. I think we could have something a lot simpler where first-timers, particularly underrepresented submitters, are just guided through a checklist, and there's just some volunteers that would be prepared to help with errors and issues that come up in the checks and the tests, help them solve issues identified by CRAN, and sort of compared to the R package developed mailing list, it would be more of a pair programming sort of situation where there's sort of one or two people that you sort of assign to that will guide you through the process of getting your package on CRAN for the first time, and assuming that it all goes well, perhaps people could be given a little bit of guidance about how they would go about resubmission, so that they're set up then to go on and to maintain their CRAN package. And I think if we had such a group, had such a service and had such a group of volunteers that they could work with the CRAN team, who are obviously very busy, to help them, keep the checklist for new submissions up to date with the common issues. There was a sort of initiative from the community to try and set up such a list on GitHub. I think this, the one I've linked here is maintained by Colin Fay, but that was sort of set up and hasn't been maintained. So there's sort of some willing there from the community to do this type of thing, but it needs a bit of organisation. So if that's something anybody would like to pursue further, then I'd be happy to talk to you. Right, finally, the tricky one, R core. Well, if I haven't touched enough thorny issues already. So this is what Peter skimmed across this morning. So he didn't have time to talk about it, but I will. So I think it was possibly the original motivation for setting up the Forwards task force is that there were obviously no women on R4, and they were concerned about the lack of diversity, and that is still the situation. And I think we can learn a lot from what's been going on in recent years in other programming communities, and I'd particularly like to focus on Python, who have had some success in adding women to their team. So about 5 years ago, Guido van Rossum, who at the time was the benevolent dictator for life, made an announcement at the PyCon conference. He said, "I want at least 2 female core Python devs in the next year." And there was lots of applause. So people liked this idea, and it obviously was a nice, ambitious idea. And Victor Steiner, in a talk last year, gave a bit of an update on this. So in fact, there were still no core devs the next year, but they did make it to 2 women core devs in 2017, and at least whenever PyCon is, sort of summer 2019, there were 5 women core devs. I don't know if there's any more since, but they started to get a few women on the team, and this is out of about 30 active core devs. The total number is 80, 90, but there's quite a lot of people that aren't that active. So how do they do this? Well, Marietta Wiyaya, who was the first woman to join the team, described the process in a great talk from PyCon 2018. And she described the process of moving up, but I'm particularly focusing here on how people become a contributor and how people become part of the core team. So how did she go about it? She read the dev guide, which is a really great resource that Python have online that anybody can look at, a developer's guide that starts you straight from setting up Git, explaining how to do tests, explaining how to make a pull request, do code review, and so on. She joined the 2 mailing lists, Python Dev, which is a little bit like RDevel, talking about the development of the language, and also something that I think is fairly unique to Python, the core mentorship mailing list. Then she set about finding some issues on the bug tracker, Now, the bug tracker for Python is not just bugs, it includes issues that people have set out for development. She found some things that she was interested in working on, and she proposed a pull request. And what I found interesting, sort of viewing this as an outsider, is that all of these steps can be done by anybody. You don't need any special permissions to do this. It can certainly be done by non-core members. So at this stage, we're just talking about what you can do, how you can contribute to Python. So how then do you go from being a Python contributor to a Python core developer? Well, there you have to gain the trust of the current core devs. And how do you do that? Well, it's by showing what you can do through your pull requests, through reviewing pull requests, interacting on the mailing list, so the two I've already mentioned, and also they have a internet relay chat channel and a Zulip instance for a bit more of a chat interface where you can actually talk to the core developers. They also have a role on their bug tracker called developer with a capital D, and these are people who are able to triage issues and have an initial look at the bugs or the issues that have been raised and point people to them that are suitable for tackling those issues. So again, all of these things can be done by anybody, but this is sort of how you build up your reputation and how you can, particularly because you're interacting with the core devs, how the core devs can get to know you and begin to trust you. And a key aspect alongside this process is the mentoring that core devs have done. And Victor Steiner, in his talk that I've already mentioned from last year, talks about mentoring as a scalable solution both to core dev burnout and a lack of diversity. So Victor himself had experienced, I think at the beginning of last year, a period of burnout, and he was actually told by his doctor, you've got to stop, and he had to stop doing all his work on Python core development for a month or so. And of course, it's a real issue in open source that people give a lot of their free time to developments, and there is a risk of burnout. And I think, perhaps as we're thinking about the R community, we also have to think about the issue of people getting older and wanting to retire. So burnout isn't the only way that we can lose developers. So we have these issues, and why not think about lack of diversity at the same time? So this is what Python core devs have been trying to do. I've put a couple of refs there to some notes of some meetings they had, for example, at the Python Language Summit. So people that are interested can go and read some more detail, but I've summarized sort of the main things that they've been doing in recent years, one of which was moved to GitHub a few years ago, which was recognized to encourage new contributors because it's much more transparent what the core devs are doing. There's a much clearer process of how to contribute. They've documented how people get promoted from user to contributor to core dev team. They're currently working on a guide for the core devs on how to mentor people, a tutorial for contributors. A couple of the core devs are offering office hours, so both public, for example, on the Zulip chat platform, and private, so you can set up a meeting, just I guess a Zoom meeting or something. They also have a code of conduct that governs the code of conduct across the project as a whole, and they sort of beef that up by adding an enforcement procedure to it. So there's lots of things that they're doing, but I think mentoring is a really important issue here. And in the notes, Victor mentions that his sort of the effort that he has to put into mentoring is just a few emails a week, but it's obviously having a big impact. So he says it's a lot less than the effort you have to put in to mentor Google Summer of Code project, for example. So a small sort of act of mentoring can help make a big impact. Okay, so running out of time a bit, but I've just got a few more slides, so we'll see how we go. I just briefly want to mention a couple of other ideas from other communities. I think this first one from Rust is really interesting. So they had these diversity scholarships, but they weren't just simply travel grants. What they were actually mentorships. So people that were accepted for the scholarships invested a few hours a week over a few months to work on a project that was proposed by the Rust team. And then the following year, they got a travel scholarship to the Rust conference. So I think this is something that appears to be very doable. I think it's something we could consider for the R community. We already have diversity scholarships that use R, so it would just be choosing those scholars a year earlier and setting them to work. And if the mentees are only expected to invest a few hours a week, then presumably the mentors, it would be quite light investment from the mentors once they've, outlined the project. Another thing that various software communities are doing is to offer outreachy projects, which are specifically targeted at people from underrepresented groups. And these are much sort of heavier projects. So it's a paid internship where people are expected to work full-time for 3 months. And I think that's a bit harder to implement because then that requires more investment from the mentor as well. And I think this is the main barrier to us doing this in the R community, because we don't have, unlike some software projects, we don't have people that are generally paid to work on R. And investing 5 hours a week is a lot to ask of somebody, but I put it out there. Possibly it's something that somebody would be willing to do if they had a sabbatical, or perhaps they retired or went part-time or something. So it's a possibility. I'd like to recognise that the RCOL are thinking about these issues, and they are starting to make steps to do more outreach, partly just because they need more people to contribute. So last October, Thomas Calavera and Luke Tierney wrote a call for help reviewing bug reports, which is really nice. It sort of really explained how you go about reviewing a bug report. But from the board's point of view and other community leaders' point of view, we didn't know this was coming up, and so it took us a bit by surprise. And I think more could have been done and could still be done to use this as an opportunity to reach out to underrepresented groups. So this is another opportunity where core devs or seasoned contributors could offer some mentoring or a tutorial or a webinar to get people started on this, or at least work with people like Forwards and Our Ladies groups to actually reach out and encourage people to contribute. So, publishing a blog post is great, but you actually need to encourage people to contribute and to point people to it and say, this is for you, we'd like you to contribute. But anyway, as I mentioned, the blog post was a very nice write-up, and I think that's the sort of thing that could become part of a more comprehensive developer guide, as Python has, that would help all new contributors, because it would make the process more transparent. Our core as I say, have been thinking about how to reach out, and a few things they're planning this year for UseR 2020 in St. Louis is to have an outreach slot adjoining the keynote talk, which will be 10 minutes talk, 10 minutes Q&A, a parallel session dedicated to our core speakers, and a tutorial by Thomas Calavera on contributing to base R. So these are really great developments. I guess the only thing I'd like to possibly add and to encourage our core to think more about is to think about making room for more personal interactions that allow the trust to be built up, to allow the relationships to be built with new people. So perhaps a bit more of a conscious effort to mix at the social events so that people can meet our core and other contributors. And I'm just throwing out some ideas of, I think, perhaps there could be an opportunity for participants to book time with one or more R core person during the conference. I mean, it's quite a unique time when a lot of R core people turn up. Maybe there'd be an R core booth, like a sponsored booth, or many R core carry on coding away during the conference. Maybe there could be a live coding lounge where we can see what they're doing on the big screen. You know, just need to maybe think a bit more innovatively around these ideas. One thing that Michael Lawrence has floated recently is the idea of having a request for proposals. So, as Hadley was saying, R has a few weird quirks, and you know, there are some things that people see as a deficiency in R at the moment, and maybe our core was make a request for proposals and have community teams propose solutions. This is quite a sort of a top-down approach still, and I think maybe we could think, again, looking at the Python community, they have a Python ideas mailing list where anybody, core devs or others, can just float ideas, see what gains traction, and if ideas gain some traction, then they can make a more formal Python enhancement proposal. You know, so maybe that's something we could think about, so that ideas can come from both directions. Okay, right. So to try and summarize what I've been saying, I think there's things we can all do to support community-driven efforts for better inclusion of underrepresented groups. I think Forwards has sort of got this quite well in hand in partnership with other community groups like Our Ladies, and you know, work in complement to general moves in the tech industry and community to promote diversity and inclusion. So I think we're sort of, I feel we're kind of on top of that. And I think there's a lot of ideas from outside and inside the R community of how to get more contributors in general, and from our underrepresented groups in particular. I feel Forwards is a bit limited on what we can do here. You know, we don't have enough active members on the task force, particularly that are wanting to work on Forwards. It's called the on-ramps team. It's always been a sort of aspirational team where that's supposed to be working on encouraging people to move from users to developers. And you know, we don't have enough active people. And I think in order to really make progress, we need to have active participation of our core and other people that are already contributing. You know, it's hard to tell people how to do things if you don't do it yourself. So we need people with the experience to mentor other people. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. So I will rudely take the floor myself and ask the first question or comment. So I was wondering about the African art community thing, whether we could somehow leverage on other initiatives. And there's one specific one in the UK, which is called, I think, AIMS, African Institute of Mathematical Statistics. Mm-hmm. So many of these people are also sort of very interested in art. And AIMS I think AIMS is run maybe by the Royal Statistical Society, or at least the Royal Statistical Society has a lot of funding for how to volunteer for this sort of project. So I was just wondering if we could somehow sort of coup that and run projects both in African countries and remotely, like Hadley style.
Yeah, so AIMS is an African institute that has a number of sites in different places in Africa, and the Royal Statistical Society in the UK helps support volunteer lecturers and things to go to the institute and
so there's teach. A pot of money. A little bit.
Well, I don't know how much money there is, I know that they do use some. They do use R in some of the teaching, but this is the sort of thing I mean in terms of you know, sharing contacts and making connections. That's certainly the sort of thing we want to leverage, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel or, you know, run all our own workshops if somebody else is running one just down the road. We need to make best use of people's resources and time.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's really cool that you mentioned there could be the future somehow
for remote participation. Yeah, I have thought about it a little bit. One thing I wanted to try at last useR was to have some Google Hangouts so that people who were not at the conference would be able to have a discussion with the keynote speakers. And actually, I got a bit of resistance from the local organisers because they were like, well, you know, people at the conference want to talk to the keynote speakers during the break, so we shouldn't take up their time. So there's a lot of time pressure in a conference. Breaks are short. It's difficult to, you know, you need to allow people to have a break, to have coffee, to have lunch, and they don't necessarily want to miss sessions. So that is a challenge to think about how to involve people that aren't there. One thing that we've had recently, I think last year was the first time we used the Slido platform. I'm not sure if you've ever used that, but it allows people to ask questions even if they're not at the conference. Obviously, that relies on live streaming, but that is something we tend to have. So we have the live stream, and people who aren't there can ask questions. So that is one way to get involved. But that is certainly you know, one of the more challenging things, because as you say, it's quite easy relatively to stream a talk, but it's not so easy to replicate the interactions. And that again is one of the advantages of the regional hub model, is that you maximize the in-person interaction with minimizing the environmental cost and financial cost and so on. So that's sort of why I'm quite keen on that, as well as it being, the idea is still that the regional hubs have the same standard as the main conference as well, because we also want to enable people to get credit, particularly people working in academia. We want you know, the conference presentation to mean something for them, and you know, for it to be academically credible as well.
Anyone else?
Yep. Thanks for putting that all together and like so many suggestions what everyone can sort of find something that they can help contribute to this. I have a quick question about the forwards package building workshops.
Sure.
Is that something that forwards members are doing, or is it also the idea that people who may not have the time to contribute to forwards regularly but have knowledge in package building can pick up the material and teach for forwards to a group who otherwise does not have that much access?
Yeah, so the idea was that we would run a certain number of workshops. So in fact, our original proposal was that we'd run one in the US, one in Europe, and one in Australia/New Zealand. And by doing that, sort of develop the materials that then anybody could use, and because they're Creative Commons licensed, they can also be adapted. So this is why we're writing the workshop guide, to try and so that people have the information that they need to run this themselves. So once we get to that stage, you know, it doesn't have to have, you know, you can teach it to anybody. It doesn't have to be associated or approved by forwards. We can obviously provide some support in terms of organising it, but we hope that it would just be run at our ladies, our user groups, coding clubs, you know, whoever wants to do it. And obviously we'd love for it to be used particularly for underrepresented groups, but there's no restriction. The resources need a little bit of organisation still. Everybody who's done it sort of wanted to teach in a different format, so it started off in Keynote, and then it got changed to PowerPoint, and then it got changed to Google Docs, and now we're changing it to Sharingan, and we're sort of modifying a little bit, you know, tweaking the material still. So it's still a bit rough around the edges at the moment, but that's certainly the aspiration, that it'd be something that people can pick up quite easily without having to prepare a lot of material themselves. Obviously, you need some experience in package development, but assuming you have that, it should be sort of relatively easy to put on a workshop yourself. Yeah.
That sounds great, and I hope it scales well.
Yeah.
All right, let's thank Heather again.